General who led the fight against extremists in Indonesia appears headed for victory in that country's first direct presidential election. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono is leading President Megawati Sukarno Putri with about 60% of the vote in a runoff. For some perspective, we're joined by Jose Manuel Tesoro, a former Jakarta correspondent for Asia Week and author of The Invisible Palace, the true story of a journalist's murder in Java. Nice to have you on the program. I'll ask you about the book you've written in just a moment, but first, your thoughts on this election. It looks as though Yudhoyono is going to win. What are your hopes? What do you think that Indonesians believe that he can deliver for them?
I think what they're looking for is change. I think that's what Indonesians have been hoping for a long time. They've lived with a kind of structure in which the elites hold power, in which they don't hold any power, and they want change.
Is he able to deliver, though? I mean, there's a lot expected. You say they want change. When you look at the issues he needs to deal with, corruption, the economy, and of course this ongoing war against terrorism, trying to get to the bottom of that and deal with Jemaah Islamiyah, is he up to it?
Well, Bambang Yudhoyono is a capable man. I know him. I've interviewed him on several occasions. And the thing is, though, he can be quite an intellectual. And the challenge for him is to be able to transfer that intellect and that drive and that policy-making possibilities into real managerial capabilities to take care of the parliament, to take care of the army.
Is it going to be difficult, particularly when you're dealing with an organisation such as Jemaah Islamiyah, and we've seen that politicians in the past have been reluctant to try to tackle that group head-on? Is it going to be difficult to try to isolate that group and to deal with the war on terror, particularly without looking as though it's doing the bidding of the United States?
I mean, it is very difficult. Indonesia, after all, is the largest Muslim country in the world. You've got more than 80% of the population as Muslim. And a lot of them identify, if not necessarily with the tactics of Jemaah Islamiyah, at least sometimes with the goals. And it's very hard to distinguish between those two things. And Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono has his work cut out for him.
I want to ask you now about the book you've written. You've particularly focused on the killing of a journalist in 1996 who'd been writing anti-government stories critical of the government.
Yes.
Looking at your experiences there and looking at press freedom since 1988, what are your thoughts about the freedom of the media today and the pressure that's still on the media to impose some of its own self-censorship?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, it took me about 3 years to complete The Invisible Palace, and I wrote it because I wanted to do a true crime nonfiction novel, but using an Asian story. And I think my colleagues, other Asian journalists, do the same thing. They apply the crafts, a Western craft, actually journalism, to their own Asian stories. And that actually makes them, in a sense, strangers in their own culture, because they look for openness, they look for truth, they look for accuracy in cultures, in a kind of politics in which that's not really acceptable.
And we also know that you can still be jailed. We've seen an evidence of this, an example of this, where reporters can still be jailed for libel in Indonesia as well. What does this say about press freedom?
You're absolutely correct. And, you know, the book is about a journalist murdered, but there's many different ways in which you can muzzle the press. They can be jailed, they can be sued. And in a sense, the trend now is less state violence against journalists, but rather more like private intimidation. And I think the trend is disturbing.
Nice to have you on the program. Jose Manuel Tesoro, former Jakarta correspondent for Asia Week, now author of The Invisible Palace. Thank you.
Treasurer